The rain was pouring down on Beverly Hills that Thursday afternoon when Daniel Crawford parked his silver Mercedes-Benz in front of the imposing gates of Whitmore Mansion, a legendary property spanning nearly 5 acres of the most exclusive hillsides in Los Angeles. And he was there not as a casual visitor, but as the new chief financial officer of Whitmore Industries, one of the largest technology corporations in the United States, hired with a salary of $500,000 annually, plus substantial bonuses. And his first task was to meet with the company's CEO at that historic mansion to discuss international expansion strategies. Daniel had researched the Whitmore family extensively. He knew they were a business dynasty that built their fortune since the 19th century, starting with railroads and later diversifying into technology, real estate, and investments. The current patriarch was supposedly Thomas Whitmore, a 70-year-old man who rarely appeared in public. And Daniel was nervous but confident because he had worked for Goldman Sachs and McKinsey before, had all the right credentials, the perfect educational pedigree with an MBA from Harvard, and was determined to impress his new employers right from the first meeting. When the gates opened automatically after he pressed intercom, Daniel drove slowly down the avenue of cypress trees that led up to the main mansion, a magnificent 3-story French colonial structure with imposing white columns, huge windows with ornate frames, and perfectly manicured gardens that stretched in every direction. There were marble fountains, classically positioned statues, and in the background he could see a separate guest house that was probably larger than most normal houses in California. Daniel parked in front of the main entrance, grabbed his Italian leather brief, quickly checked his appearance in the rearview mirror, ensuring his hair was perfectly combed and his Hermes tie was aligned, then got out of the car and ascended the marble steps toward the massive front door. He rang the doorbell and waited, hearing the sound echo inside the mansion. After a few seconds, the door opened, revealing a young woman whom Daniel immediately assumed was one of the household maids. She was around 28, with wavy brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing faded jeans and a white t-shirt stained with what looked like dirt or gardening soil. She had gardening gloves on one hand and held pruning shears in the other, and there was a patch of dirt on her face that she apparently hadn't noticed. Daniel quickly assessed her with that look that wealthy people develop, that look that instantaneously categorizes others as superior or inferior based on appearance and context. And he definitely placed her in the servant category. So, without even greeting her properly or asking her name, Daniel simply said in an imperious tone that he was there for a meeting with Mr. Whitmore and that she should inform him of his arrival immediately because he didn't have time to waste. The young woman merely looked at him with a neutral expression that he couldn't fully interpret. There was something in her eyes that should have alerted Daniel, a sharp intelligence, maybe even a hint of amusement. But he was so absorbed in his own self-importance that he noticed none of it. She simply opened the door wider and gestured for him to enter, saying in a calm, polite voice that Mr. Whitmore was waiting in the office and that she would lead him there. Daniel entered the main hall and couldn't help but admire it for a moment because the interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the exterior. The floor was intricate Italian marble, there was a baccarat crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling that probably cost more than a luxury car, the walls were decorated with what appeared to be original paintings by European masters, and a curved double staircase ascended majestically to the second floor. But Daniel quickly recomposed his expression to one of studied indifference, because he didn't want to seem too impressed. After all, he was destined to be part of that world of extreme wealth. So he followed the young woman through corridors decorated with Persian rugs and more works of art, and during the walk he committed his first serious error. He began treating her exactly as he would treat any servant, with that toxic mixture of condescension and casual indifference. He commented that the mansion needed better cleaning, pointing to a bit of imaginary dust on a side table. Criticized the flower arrangement in the living room, saying it looked amateur and that they should hire a professional florist. And then, in the moment that would seal his fate in that house, Daniel stopped abruptly in the hallway and turned to the young woman, saying in an irritated tone that she should have changed clothes before answering the door, because appearing so dirty and disheveled in front of important visitors reflected poorly on the Whitmore family's reputation. He said that when he became part of the company's senior management, one of the first things he would do would be to implement stricter dress codes for all the household staff. The young woman said nothing in response, just kept walking toward the office, but Daniel noticed that the corners of her mouth curved slightly upward into an almost imperceptible smile, which he interpreted as nervousness or perhaps timid agreement with his observations. They finally arrived at a pair of double doors made of carved mahogany, and the young woman opened them, revealing a magnificent office with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a marble fireplace, huge windows overlooking the gardens, and an antique executive desk that probably dated back to the 18th century. But the office was empty. There was no one there. Daniel looked around confusedly and then turned to the young woman, about to ask where Mr. Whitmore was. But before he could speak, she calmly removed the gardening gloves, placed the pruning shears on a side table, and then walked to the executive chair behind the large desk and sat in it with the posture of someone who had sat there thousands of times before. She interlaced her fingers on the desk, looked directly at Daniel with those intelligent eyes that now sparkled with something that was definitely amusement, and said with a clear, authoritative voice that had no trace of the deference servants typically use, she said that Mr. Thomas Whitmore, her grandfather, had passed away 3 years ago, and that she, Olivia Whitmore, was now the CEO of Whitmore Industries and the owner of that mansion, and that everything Daniel had said in the last 15 minutes was extremely revealing about his character. And in that moment, Daniel's world completely stopped. He felt the blood drain from his face as the full realization of what had just happened hit him like a freight train. He had treated the company's CEO, his new boss, the woman who literally had the power to fire him before he even started, as if she were an incompetent maid, and he had done so with such complete arrogance that there was no way to undo or minimize it.
Daniel remained completely paralyzed in the middle of that luxurious office as he tried to process the informational bomb that Olivia Whitmore had just detonated. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His brain was racing, trying to find some way to recover from that catastrophic humiliation, some plausible excuse, some explanation that could minimize the absolute disaster he had created in the first 15 minutes of being in that house. But Olivia gave him no chance to recover. She continued speaking with that calm, controlled voice that was somehow much more intimidating than shouting would have been, explaining that when Daniel was hired 3 weeks ago through the Human Resources Department, based on his impressive credentials and brilliant recommendations, she had decided to meet him personally before his official start date because at Whitmore Industries they valued not only technical competence, but also character, integrity, and how people treated those they perceived as having less power or status than themselves. So Olivia had deliberately dressed casually and was gardening when Daniel arrived, specifically to see how he would react to encountering someone he would assume was a maid. It was a test she frequently applied to potential high-level executives, and Daniel had failed spectacularly. She detailed every condescending comment he had made, every scornful look, every arrogant word, and rhetorically asked what kind of chief financial officer would treat company team members with such disrespect simply because of their perceived position. Olivia explained that Whitmore Industries employed over 15,000 people worldwide, from engineers with PhDs to maintenance and cleaning staff, and that every one of those people deserved basic respect and dignity regardless of their role or function. A company was only as strong as its weakest link, and if senior executives treated lower-level employees with disdain, it created a toxic corporate culture that would eventually destroy everything from the inside. Daniel finally found his voice and began to stammer a desperate excuse, saying it had been a terrible misunderstanding, that he normally didn't behave that way, that he was nervous and it somehow came out completely wrong. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak and unconvincing they sounded. Olivia merely looked at him with that neutral expression that didn't reveal whether she was angry or simply disappointed. And then she did something completely unexpected. Instead of firing him immediately, as Daniel was absolutely certain she would do, Olivia said she would give him a second chance,
but with very specific conditions. For the next 30 days, Daniel would work at the mansion not as a chief financial officer, but performing various service roles. He would spend 1 week working with the gardening crew, 1 week with the domestic cleaning staff, 1 week with the drivers and security, and 1 week in the kitchen with the chef and culinary team. During that time, he would receive only the California minimum wage. He would live in the staff quarters at the back of the property, and he would be treated exactly like any other member of the service team. And only after completing that 1-month period, if he demonstrated genuine growth, real humility, and a change in attitude, then perhaps, just perhaps, he would be reconsidered for the chief financial officer position. But if at any time during that month he complained, displayed the same arrogance, or refused to perform any task, he would be immediately fired, and Olivia would personally ensure that his reputation in the financial industry was ruined because she had connections everywhere. Daniel listened to that proposal with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The rational part of his brain told him to simply refuse, maintain some dignity, and look for another job, but the ambitious part that had taken him so far in his career quickly calculated the implications. If he left now with a firing before officially starting, he would have to explain that humiliating gap to future employers. His reputation would suffer either way, and he would lose the opportunity to work for one of the most prestigious companies in the tech industry. On the other hand, if he completed that degrading month and got the position, he would have a story of overcoming that could eventually be reframed in his personal narrative as a growth experience. So, swallowing his massive pride, which hurt physically going down his throat, Daniel agreed to Olivia's terms. And she responded by saying that he would start immediately, that very afternoon, working with Marcus, the head gardener, and that he should exchange that expensive Armani suit for work clothes that would be provided, and with that, the first phase of Daniel Crawford's ordeal began.
Marcus Thompson was a 52-year-old African-American man with calloused hands, a sun-weathered face that showed decades of outdoor work, and a quiet dignity that Daniel immediately perceived, and which made him feel even more ashamed of his previous behavior. Marcus had worked for the Whitmore family for nearly 30 years, starting as a gardener's assistant at 22 and rising to become the supervisor of the entire landscaping team. He managed 5 different gardens scattered across the property, including an award-winning rose garden, an organic vegetable patch that supplied fresh produce for the mansion's kitchen, and a Japanese Zen garden that Olivia's grandfather had commissioned decades ago from artisans brought especially from Kyoto. When Olivia introduced Daniel to Marcus that afternoon, explaining the unusual situation and the 1-month experiment they were conducting, Marcus merely nodded calmly and looked Daniel up and down in a way that clearly communicated that he had seen many arrogant executives in his life and was not particularly impressed. He handed Daniel a set of work clothes, worn denim pants, a work shirt embroidered with the Whitmore Estate logo, heavy gardening boots, and thick gloves, and pointed to a small bathroom at the back of the gardening shed where Daniel could change. When Daniel emerged a few minutes later, with his expensive clothes neatly folded in a bag and wearing the work uniform that smelled faintly of soil and previous use sweat, he felt as though he had been transported to another dimension of reality. Marcus wasted no time with pleasantries or lengthy instructions, simply said they had a lot of work ahead because planting season was approaching and they needed to prepare the flower beds. Then handed Daniel a shovel and pointed to an area of the garden that needed to be dug up and turned over. Daniel awkwardly held the shovel. Never having actually done physical manual labor in his entire privileged life, he had grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, in an affluent family, attended elite preparatory schools where the most physical work he did was played tennis, and his entire career had been spent in air-conditioned offices moving numbers on spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. But now, there he was, under the hot California sun, with that relentless sun that Marcus and his team faced every day, and Daniel began to dig. The first 15 minutes were difficult, but manageable. He felt his muscles working in ways they weren't used to, but thought he could endure it.
However, after half an hour, his shoulders began to burn. After 45 minutes, his hands were developing blisters even through the thick gloves, and after a full hour of digging and turning heavy, compacted soil, Daniel was completely exhausted in a way he had never experienced. His back screamed in protest, his face was red and sweating profusely, his work clothes were soaked, and he felt as if his arms would fall off at any moment. Marcus worked a few feet away, performing this same job but with an efficiency born of decades of practice. His movements were economical and rhythmic, and he showed no signs of tiredness, even doing 3 times the work Daniel was. And what made it all worse was that other members of the gardening team, who initially observed the new recruit with curiosity, eventually started whispering amongst themselves and occasionally laughing when Daniel made obvious mistakes or struggled with tasks that were clearly basic for them. There was Miguel, 35, who emigrated from Michoacan, Mexico, and had worked in landscaping for 15 years. There was Tommy, 23, who was saving money for college by working on the property. And there was James, 61, who had been in the gardening business since he was a teenager and could identify hundreds of plant species just by touch. These men worked hard every day for wages that were a fraction of what Daniel was used to earning, and yet they maintained their dignity, their professionalism, and clearly took pride in the work they did. As Daniel struggled with his simple task of preparing flower beds, he began to have uncomfortable realizations about how he had lived completely isolated from how most people actually work. His whole life, he had consumed the fruits of other people's labor without ever considering the actual physical effort that went into sustaining his comfortable existence. Someone cultivated the food he ate without thinking, someone cleaned the offices where he worked, someone maintained the gardens of the properties where he lived, and he had never devoted a single thought to these people or recognized their essential humanity. And now, for the first time in his life, he was on the other side of that equation, being the invisible worker doing hard labor that allowed others to live comfortably. When the clock finally struck 5 in the afternoon and Marcus announced that the workday was over, Daniel was never so relieved in his entire life. But his relief was short-lived when Marcus informed him that they would start tomorrow at 6 in the morning because they had to work before the sun got too hot in the middle of the day. Daniel simply nodded in agreement because he was too exhausted to form coherent words. Then Marcus led him to the staff quarters at the back of the property where Daniel would stay for the month. It was a simple structure with small but clean rooms that housed several team members who lived on the property. Daniel was assigned a room of approximately 10 square meters with a narrow bed, an old dresser, a small window overlooking the back gardens, and a shared bathroom down the hall. The contrast with his luxurious apartment in Century City could not be starker. But Daniel was so physically destroyed that he barely noticed the modest accommodations. He simply collapsed onto the narrow bed, still in his dirty work clothes, and immediately plunged into a deep, dreamless sleep. And on that first night in his new, humble situation, something began to change deep within Daniel Crawford's conscience. It was just a tiny crack in the armor of his arrogance, but it was there. The following days on the gardening crew were a brutal ordeal that tested Daniel in ways he never imagined possible. Every morning at 5:45, Marcus knocked on his door, waking him from a deep sleep that never seemed long enough because his sore muscles needed far more recovery than a few hours of rest could provide. Daniel dragged himself out of bed, feeling every muscle protest, took a quick shower in the shared bathroom where hot water was inconsistent at best, put on the work clothes that were now permanently stained with dirt no matter how many times they were washed, and stumbled to the staff kitchen where simple coffee and toast awaited. Nothing like the artisanal lattes and French croissants he used to grab at Earth Cafe every morning on the way to the office. But Daniel discovered that when you are truly hungry from strenuous physical labor, even simple black coffee and buttered toast taste absolutely delicious. After a quick breakfast, the gardening team gathered in the tool shed where Marcus handed out the day's tasks, and Daniel quickly learned that maintaining elaborate gardens on a property the size of Whitmore Mansion was an incredibly complex operation that required specialized knowledge of botany, horticulture, irrigation systems, pest control, soil composition, and hundreds of other technical details. Marcus wasn't just a laborer, as Daniel had arrogantly assumed. He was essentially a horticultural scientist with decades of practical experience, knowledge that no amount of formal education could replace. He instinctively knew when each plant needed water based on subtle changes in leaf color, could diagnose plant diseases just by observing growth patterns, and could predict how different species would interact when planted close together, considering factors like competition for nutrients, sunlight needs, and root system compatibility. Miguel, in turn, was an expert in irrigation systems and could fix any problem with the complex water lines feeding the entire property. Tommy had a natural talent for landscape design and often suggested plant arrangements that Marcus implemented, and James was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge about native California plants and sustainable gardening techniques. During the second week, while working in the rose garden, which required particularly meticulous care because these specific roses were rare varieties that had won awards in international competitions, Marcus began teaching Daniel not just how to prune, but the why behind every cut. He explained how strategic pruning directed the plant's energy to produce larger, more vibrant blooms, how the angle of each cut affected future growth, how to identify sick or dead branches that needed removal for the plant's overall health. And Daniel discovered to his surprise that he was genuinely interested. For the first time in his adult life, he was creating something tangible with his own hands. He could see the direct results of his work not as abstract numbers on a spreadsheet, but as real plants growing and flourishing because of his care. There was one particularly impactful moment on the 8th day when they were planting new lavender bushes along one of the pathways. Daniel had dug the holes according to Marcus's specific instructions regarding depth and spacing, prepared the soil by mixing in organic compost, and carefully positioned each young plant before covering it with dirt and watering thoroughly. When they finished, Marcus stepped back to observe the work and then did something that completely surprised Daniel. He smiled. It was a small but genuine smile, and he simply said that Daniel had done good work. Those seedlings would grow strong and healthy, and in 5 years, that path would be one of the most beautiful parts of the entire garden. And something about that moment, about receiving sincere recognition for honest physical labor, about knowing that something he had created would exist and flourish years into the future, touched something deep in Daniel. Unexpected tears began to form in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, pretending it was sweat. But Marcus saw and said nothing, merely placing a calloused hand on Daniel's shoulder for a moment before returning to work. That night, Daniel did not immediately fall asleep as he had done every previous night. Instead, he lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and truly thinking about his life for the first time in years. He had spent his entire career chasing money, status, impressive titles, bigger bonuses. For what exactly? He had no real friends, only networking contacts. He had no hobbies or passions outside of work. He had no significant relationships because he always prioritized his career. His family back in Connecticut barely spoke to him except during obligatory holidays. And now realizing, honestly, he couldn't say he was happy. Successful according to conventional metrics, certainly, but deeply unhappy and empty inside. And here was Marcus, a man who probably earned in a year what Daniel used to spend on clothes and expensive restaurants in a few months. Yet Marcus seemed genuinely content, took pride in his work, had strong relationships with his team who functioned like a family, and could point to those magnificent gardens and say with absolute honesty that he had created something beautiful and lasting. Daniel realized that he had wasted decades chasing the wrong things, valuing the wrong metrics, and treating people like stepping stones in his climb, instead of recognizing their essential humanity and intrinsic worth, regardless of their social or economic position.
During the 3rd week, when Daniel was transferred to work with the domestic cleaning crew, he thought it would be easier than the strenuous gardening work, but he quickly discovered he was completely wrong about that too. The cleaning team was led by Rosa Martinez, a 47-year-old Salvadoran woman who had immigrated to the United States 25 years ago with only $300 in her pocket and dreams of a better life for her children. She worked 6 days a week cleaning houses during the day and took night shifts at a laundry 3 times a week to save extra money. She managed to bring her 2 children to the United States legally after years of bureaucratic process, and now her daughter was at UCLA studying engineering, and her son was in his senior year of high school with excellent grades and plans to apply to Berkeley. Rosa was small physically but had a presence that commanded immediate respect, and when Olivia introduced Daniel to Rosa, explaining that he would spend a week learning from the cleaning crew, Rosa looked at him with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through any pretense, and said directly that she would not tolerate laziness or shoddy work, that her team maintained very high standards because their reputation depended on it, and that he would need to work as hard as everyone else if he wanted her respect. Rosa's team consisted of 4 women, including herself. There was Carmen, 32, who had 3 small children at home and somehow balanced full-time work with single motherhood because the children's father had abandoned the family. There was Lupita, 56, who had worked in domestic cleaning for 30 years and was an absolute perfectionist in her job. And there was Jennifer, a 24-year-old who was working while attending night classes for accounting at the community college. These women worked with incredible efficiency that came from years of practice. They could clean an entire room in the time it took Daniel to figure out where the cleaning products were stored. They knew exactly which products to use on which surfaces to get the best results without causing damage. They had organized systems to maximize efficiency, moving through the mansion in choreographed patterns that minimized wasted steps. And they worked with a constant rhythm that allowed them to complete enormous amounts of work without appearing rushed or stressed. Rosa started Daniel with basic tasks like vacuuming, dusting, and cleaning bathrooms, and he quickly discovered that professional cleaning work was much harder and more detailed than he ever imagined. Vacuuming properly meant moving furniture, reaching every corner, adjusting settings for different types of carpet and floor, emptying and cleaning the vacuum itself when it got clogged. Dusting wasn't just quickly wiping a cloth over surfaces, but systematically cleaning every decorative object, every picture frame, every book on shelves that contained thousands of volumes, every visible and invisible surface, because dust accumulated in hidden areas eventually spread. And cleaning bathrooms, something Daniel had always considered degrading work, suitable only for lower-level people, revealed itself to require meticulous attention to sanitary details that were genuinely important for health and hygiene. In addition to the physical work, there was also the emotional dimension that Daniel had not anticipated. These women cleaned the most intimate and private spaces of the mansion, saw details of people's lives that no one else saw, and were essentially invisible to most rich visitors who passed through those corridors. Rosa explained during a lunch break that one of the hardest parts of the job wasn't the physical aspect, but the way people often treated them as if they were furniture, inanimate objects that existed only to serve. She told stories of visitors who purposely left terrible messes because they knew someone would clean it up, of people who never made eye contact or said thank you, of individuals who spoke about their domestic workers as if they were incapable of understanding English or as if their feelings didn't matter. And Daniel felt his shame deepen because he had been exactly that kind of person his whole life. How many times had he walked past cleaning staff in office buildings without even acknowledging their existence? How many times had he left messes in hotels casually thinking someone would be paid to clean it up? How many times had he spoken condescendingly to waiters, drivers, and service workers as if they were somehow less human than he was? During the 4th day, working with Rosa's team, Daniel was cleaning the main library, which contained over 5,000 rare books, some of which dated back centuries, and he accidentally knocked over an antique porcelain vase that crashed onto the marble floor and shattered into hundreds of pieces. Daniel froze in
absolute panic because that vase was probably worth thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, and he was certain he would be fired immediately. Rosa heard the noise and came running. She looked at the scattered pieces and then looked at Daniel, who was visibly trembling, expecting an outburst of anger. But instead of yelling, Rosa simply picked up a broom and dustpan and began carefully sweeping up the pieces, saying calmly that accidents happen, that she would inform Miss Whitmore about the incident, but that Daniel shouldn't worry excessively because objects are replaceable and no one had been hurt. That simple, undeserved kindness, after how he had treated people like Rosa his whole life, was like a punch to the stomach. Daniel felt genuine tears streaming down his face and didn't try to hide them this time. He apologized profusely, not just for the vase, but for everything, for all the years of arrogance and casual disrespect towards service workers, for treating people as invisible or inferior, for never having recognized the dignity and humanity of people doing honest, essential work. Rosa stopped sweeping and looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something Daniel would never forget. She said that everyone makes mistakes, and that what matters is not where you start, but where you go. That she had seen many rich and powerful people pass through that mansion over the years, and that most never changed, never learned, never grew beyond their arrogance. But she could see that Daniel was truly trying to understand, truly trying to change, and that was rare and valuable. Then she gave him a piece of advice that would echo in his mind for years. She said that true character is not revealed in how you treat people who can do something for you, but in how you treat people who can do nothing for you. That the real test of a person is how they treat waiters, drivers, cleaning staff, people society considers replaceable, because those are the interactions where your true colors appear when you think no one important is watching. Daniel absorbed those words like a thirsty man in the desert, and that night he started writing in an old notebook he found in his dresser. He began documenting all the realizations he was having, all the lessons these extraordinary people were teaching him through their examples of dignity, hard work, and authentic humanity. He wrote about Marcus and how true expertise comes from years of practical experience, not just paper degrees. He wrote about Rosa and how real strength of character has nothing to do with bank accounts or zip codes. He wrote about how he had wasted decades of his life chasing the wrong things and treating people the wrong way. And he wrote a promise to himself that if he survived that month and somehow earned the chief financial officer position, he would be a different kind of executive, the kind who would recognize and value all employees regardless of their title, the kind who would build a corporate culture based on mutual respect, the kind who would use his power and privilege not to elevate himself above others, but to elevate others along with him.
The fourth and final week of Daniel's ordeal was spent in the kitchen working under the direction of Chef Pierre Dubois, a 58-year-old Frenchman who had trained in some of the most prestigious restaurants in Paris, including a period at the legendary Le Bernardin, before eventually moving to the United States. Chef Pierre was demanding, a perfectionist, and had impossible standards. But unlike the stereotypically temperamental chefs Daniel had seen on television shows, Pierre combined his demanding nature with genuine care for his team and a commitment to teaching properly. The Whitmore Mansion kitchen was a full professional operation with high-end restaurant equipment, multiple workstations, elaborate refrigeration systems, and a wine cellar that contained bottles valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The culinary team consisted of Pierre, two sous chefs named Maria and James, who each had over 15 years of experience in professional kitchens, a pastry chef named Andre, who created desserts that were literally works of art, and 3 kitchen assistants who did everything from basic ingredient preparation to cleaning and maintenance of equipment. Daniel entered the kitchen that Monday morning expecting maybe to peel potatoes or wash dishes, simple, repetitive work he could do while his mind wandered. But Pierre had other ideas. He believed that to truly appreciate food, you needed to understand every step of the process, from selecting ingredients, to cooking techniques, to final presentation. So he had Daniel start at the farmer's market at 5 in the morning, where they bought fresh produce directly from local farmers. Daniel had eaten in expensive restaurants his entire adult life, but had never thought about where that food actually came from. Never considered that someone had to wake up before dawn to pick those tomatoes at the perfect moment of ripeness. That someone had to carefully cultivate those organic lettuces, protecting them from pests without using chemical pesticides. That every ingredient represented real human labor and agricultural expertise. Pierre taught as he selected produce, explaining how to identify freshness by touch, smell, and appearance, how different varieties of the same vegetable had distinct culinary applications, how relationships with local farmers allowed access to specialty ingredients that never appeared in commercial supermarkets. Back in the kitchen, Pierre began teaching Daniel fundamental techniques, how to hold a knife properly to maximize control and efficiency while minimizing risk of injury, how to dice onions so that all the pieces were the same size for uniform cooking, how to prepare complex stocks that took hours of slow cooking time, extracting deep flavors from bones and vegetables. Daniel discovered that high-level professional cooking was both science and art. It required a precise understanding of how heat affected different proteins, how acids and fats balanced flavors, how time and temperature determined textures, and how visual presentation was as important as taste, because people eat with their eyes first. There was also the physical dimension of the work, standing for 12 hours straight, working over hot stoves that left the kitchen at temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius, even with powerful ventilation systems, carrying heavy pots, moving quickly in tight spaces without colliding with other team members, maintaining intense concentration because one moment of distraction could result in a ruined dish or worse, a serious injury. And all of this had to be done while maintaining absolute standards of cleanliness and food safety, because a single case of food poisoning could destroy a chef's reputation. On the third day working in the kitchen, Olivia Whitmore announced that she would be hosting an important dinner that Saturday with potential investors from Singapore and Hong Kong. It would be a 7-course dinner that needed to be absolutely impressive because hundreds of millions of dollars in potential business were at stake. Chef Pierre went into intensive preparation mode, planning every dish meticulously, considering cultural preferences of the Asian guests, dietary restrictions, wine pairings, even the order of the courses to create a culinary progression that told a story. Daniel was determined to contribute in some meaningful way, so he volunteered to work overtime, helping with all the prep. Pierre accepted, but warned that the standards would be inflexible. Anything less than perfection would be redone, no matter how long it took. So Daniel worked side by side with the culinary team for the next 3 days. He made chicken stock starting at 4 in the morning and letting it simmer for 18 hours until the liquid was golden and rich. He peeled and chopped mountains of vegetables until his hands developed blisters and then continued working through the pain. He cleaned and prepared fresh seafood, learning to respect the ingredients, treating them with the care they deserved. He even helped Andre make dessert components, learning delicate pastry techniques that were completely non-intuitive for someone without training. And finally, Saturday arrived, the day of the important dinner. The kitchen was in full operation mode, with every team member executing their responsibilities with military precision. Daniel was assigned to work at the plating station, ensuring that every dish leaving the kitchen was presented perfectly. He wiped the edges of plates with a damp towel, removing any spills or imperfections, adjusted the placement of elements until they were exactly as Pierre had specified,
and added final touches like edible flowers and microgreens at the last second before the plates were taken to the dining room. He could hear the conversations and laughter of the guests through the kitchen doors. And later that night, when the dinner was complete and all 7 courses had been served without a hitch, Olivia Whitmore personally came into the kitchen to thank the team. She praised Pierre effusively and then specifically mentioned Daniel, said she had observed through security cameras how much he had worked over the last 3 days, saw his dedication and attention to detail, and could see that he was genuinely changing, learning not just with his head, but with his heart. After everyone else left the kitchen, Pierre stayed behind cleaning his workstations as he did every night, and Daniel stayed to help, even though he wasn't required to do so. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then Pierre said something that surprised Daniel. He said that he had worked in professional kitchens for 40 years, had trained hundreds of young chefs, and could always identify who had real potential versus who was just passing time. True chefs weren't just people with technical skill, but people who genuinely cared, who put love into every dish, who respected ingredients and the labor that went into producing them, who valued every member of the team because they understood that great food was always collaborative, never individual. And Pierre said that he saw those qualities emerging in Daniel, that maybe he had lost his way in finance, but that it was clear he was finding something more important now. He was finding humility. He was finding connection to real work and real people. And that was a better foundation for leadership than any MBA could ever be. That Saturday night was the last night of Daniel's 1-month ordeal. The experiment was complete. And on Sunday morning, he would have a final meeting with Olivia Whitmore, where she would decide if he deserved the chief financial officer position or if he would be permanently fired. Daniel could barely sleep that night. His mind was racing through everything he had experienced over the last 4 weeks, all the lessons learned, all the extraordinary people he had met, all the ways his assumptions and prejudices had been challenged and demolished. He didn't know what Olivia would decide, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Even if he were fired, even if he never worked at Whitmore Industries, that month had transformed him fundamentally. He was no longer the arrogant person who had arrived at that mansion 4 weeks ago. Something essential had changed at the core of who he was, and no matter what happened from that point on, he would carry those lessons for the rest of his life.
On Sunday morning, Daniel woke up earlier than necessary, his nerves making it impossible to continue sleeping despite the deep exhaustion from 4 weeks of intense physical labor. He took a long shower, letting the hot water work on the muscles that still ached, and then carefully dressed in the only suit he had brought, the same Armani he wore on the first day. But somehow it looked different now, less like armor of status and more like an uncomfortable custom that no longer fit the person he had become. At 9 a.m., Daniel nervously walked to the main mansion and was received at the door not by Olivia, but by an elderly butler named Henry, who had worked for the Whitmore family for 45 years and whom Daniel had briefly met during his time there. Henry led him not to the formal office where everything had begun, but to a back terrace overlooking the gardens Daniel had helped tend. Olivia was sitting at a small table with fresh coffee and pastries. She was wearing casual weekend clothes and looked relaxed, completely different from the severe, intimidating figure who had administered that elaborate test. She gestured for Daniel to sit down and poured coffee for both of them. And then, for a long moment, she simply looked at him, studying his face in a way that made him feel simultaneously uncomfortable and curious about what she saw. Finally, Olivia began to speak. She said she had designed that 1-month experiment for a very specific reason. Her company, Whitmore Industries, employed 15,000 people globally, and there were thousands more who depended indirectly on the company through contracts, suppliers, and local economic ecosystems.
And these weren't just numbers on spreadsheets. They were real people with real families, real dreams, real fears. And they deserved leadership that recognized and valued their humanity. Her grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, had built the company on that principle. He believed that true business success was measured not only in quarterly profits, but in the quality of life you created for all stakeholders, including the lowest level employees. And Olivia had inherited not just the company, but also that philosophy. That's why she rigorously tested all high-level executives before giving them real power, because giving power to people without character was dangerous. They would create toxic cultures, make decisions that maximized short-term profits while harming people, and eventually destroy the very company they were hired to manage. So when Daniel arrived 4 weeks ago with his impressive credentials, but immediately demonstrated shocking arrogance and disrespect for someone he perceived as a maid, Olivia knew he needed that test more than most. She continued explaining that she had observed Daniel closely throughout the month, not just through security cameras, but through conversations with Marcus, Rosa, Pierre, and all the other team members who worked with him. They reported genuine transformation. They said Daniel started resistant and clumsy, but gradually opened up, learned to truly listen instead of just waiting for his turn to speak, developed genuine respect for types of expertise he had previously devalued, and most importantly, demonstrated real humility that came from lived experience, not just intellectual agreement with abstract principles. Marcus, specifically, had mentioned the lavender seedlings incident and how he saw something shift in Daniel at that moment. How Daniel started asking real questions instead of just following orders, started caring about the work for its own sake, not just as a task to be completed. Rosa had told about the broken vase and how Daniel's reaction had been so different from what she expected from a typical executive. He didn't try to blame others or minimize the incident. He accepted full responsibility and showed genuine remorse, not just for the damaged object, but for years of problematic behavior. And Pierre had said that Daniel worked harder on the dinner preparation than many young chefs who were actually trying to build culinary careers, that he showed dedication that went beyond simply completing a task. He genuinely cared about the outcome and about making his team proud. Then, Olivia asked Daniel a direct question. She asked if he understood now why she had put him through that 1-month experiment, if he saw how his initial attitudes were fundamentally problematic, not just superficially rude, but revealing deep character flaws that would make him a terrible leader. Daniel thought carefully before answering. He said honestly that yes, he understood completely. He said he had spent his entire life in a bubble of privilege, where he never had to truly see or recognize the people who did the work that allowed his comfortable existence. He had treated service workers as invisible, not out of deliberate cruelty, but out of casual indifference, which was in some ways worse because it meant he had never deemed them worthy of conscious consideration, and that was a deep moral failure that he now saw clearly. Working side by side with Marcus, Rosa, Pierre, and all their team members had forced him to confront realities he had always avoided. The reality that hard physical labor was valuable and worthy of respect even if it didn't pay well. The reality that expertise came in many forms and university degrees weren't the only or even the best indicator of knowledge and skill. The reality that every person, regardless of their position, had intrinsic dignity and deserved to be treated with basic respect. Daniel said that if Olivia decided not to give him the position, he would understand completely and would be grateful anyway for that 1 month, which had changed him more fundamentally than any other experience in his life. He had walked into the mansion 4 weeks ago as a worse version of himself and was walking out as someone who at least had a chance to become a better person. Olivia listened to this answer and then was silent for so long that Daniel began to sweat nervously. And then, finally, she smiled. It was a small but genuine smile, and she said that she had decided to give him the chief financial officer position, but with very specific conditions that would be a non-negotiable part of his employment contract.
Olivia explained that Daniel would start as chief financial officer the following Monday, but his contract would have unusual clauses that reflected the lessons of the past month. First, once per quarter during his tenure at the company, he would spend 1 full week working in a different non-executive department. Sometimes it would be in production factories, sometimes in customer service call centers, sometimes in warehouses or logistics facilities, sometimes in corporate cafeteria kitchens. The idea was that he maintained a continuous connection with the reality of the work that allowed the company to function, and that he never forgot the lessons learned that first month. Second, 20% of his annual bonus would be determined not by financial metrics, but by 360-degree evaluations from employees across all levels of the organization. People working under him would have real power to affect his compensation through feedback on his character and leadership style. This created true accountability and incentivized respectful treatment of all employees, not as an option, but as an economic necessity. Third, Daniel would be personally responsible for developing and implementing enhanced benefits programs for lower-level employees in the company, things like subsidized childcare for working parents, continuing education programs for people who wanted to develop new skills, housing assistance for employees in expensive markets like San Francisco and New York, ensuring that people working full-time for Whitmore Industries could live dignified lives, not just survive paycheck to paycheck. Fourth and most important, if at any time during his employment Daniel reverted to behaviors that demonstrated arrogance or disrespect toward any employee regardless of their position, he would be immediately terminated without severance compensation. There would be no second chances beyond the one he had already received. That test month was simultaneously his last chance and his new beginning. Daniel listened to all these conditions and without hesitation said he accepted completely. He said that those were not restrictions, but protections against him becoming the terrible person he was a month ago again. Olivia then extended her hand, and they shook hands, formalizing the agreement. And she said something more. She said that she too had learned something during that month, observing his transformation. She said she had inherited the company very young, at 26, when her grandfather passed away unexpectedly, and in the years since, she had been forced to make impossible decisions repeatedly, firing people, closing unprofitable facilities, navigating economic and technological crises that threatened to destroy everything her family built. And through it all, she had maintained her grandfather's core principle of valuing people over profits. But this had created constant tensions with other executives and board members who pressured for short-term profit maximization. They told her she was being sentimental, that modern businesses couldn't afford to prioritize employee well-being over efficiency, that she was letting feelings interfere with sound business judgment. And there were times when Olivia wondered if they were right, if she was being naive, trying to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation according to principles that were formed in a different economic era. But seeing Daniel's transformation during that month had reaffirmed her conviction. It had proven that even people deeply conditioned by toxic corporate culture could change when forced to confront the humanity of those they had learned to ignore. And if Daniel could change, then maybe it wasn't naive to believe that entire companies could operate differently, could be profitable while also treating people with dignity, could succeed in the long term precisely because they valued all stakeholders, not despite it. Olivia said that she was hiring Daniel not only because he had passed the test, but because she needed allies in executive leadership who genuinely shared that philosophy, not just superficially, who understood viscerally, not just intellectually, why those principles mattered. And she believed that after that month, Daniel could be that ally. That afternoon, after the meeting ended, Daniel went back to the staff quarters for the last time to collect his belongings. He had arranged a temporary apartment in West Hollywood where he would stay while looking for something more permanent. As he packed his few things, there was a knock at the door. It was Marcus. He had come to say goodbye and bring a gift. It was one of the lavender seedlings they had planted together weeks ago. Marcus said that this specific seedling hadn't taken root in the original spot, so he had transferred it to a pot, thinking Daniel might want to keep it as a keepsake, as a symbol of growth and transformation. Daniel accepted the pot with genuine gratitude, feeling emotions swelling in his throat. He thanked Marcus not only for the gift, but for everything he had taught him during that first week, for being patient with someone who didn't deserve patience, for modeling dignity and silent expertise that were more impressive than any show of credentials. Marcus simply nodded in his quiet way and said that he saw potential in Daniel from the beginning, that people could change if they were truly willing to do the hard work of self-reflection and growth, and he was proud to have played a small part in that transformation. Similarly, Rosa came by the room bringing a small package of traditional Salvadoran cookies she had made. She hugged Daniel tightly and said that he would always be welcome in her kitchen, that the door would be open if he needed advice or just a home-cooked meal when the corporate world got too cold and isolating. And Pierre sent a message through one of the kitchen assistants. It was a handwritten recipe for the chicken stock that Daniel had helped make. Pierre had written at the top in his elegant handwriting that great meals, like great lives, were built on simple but solid foundations, and that Daniel should remember that principle when facing complex decisions in his new position. Always start with solid fundamentals and build from there with patience and care. These simple gestures from people he had known for only a month, but who had impacted him more profoundly than colleagues he had worked with for years, meant more to Daniel than any bonus or promotion he had ever received, because they were genuine expressions of human connection. Recognition that something real had happened during that month, that true relationships had been formed, not based on utility or mutual benefit, but on genuine respect and shared experience. When Daniel finally drove through the gates of Whitmore Mansion that Sunday afternoon, the lavender seedling carefully strapped into the passenger seat, he looked in the rearview mirror at the property that had been his strictest and most transformative teacher, and he made a silent promise to himself and to those extraordinary people who had invested time and patience in him. He promised that he would never forget the lessons learned, that he would carry those experiences as a moral compass guiding every decision he made, and that he would use his position of power not to elevate himself above others, but to create opportunities and protections for all those who rarely had a voice in the executive rooms where important decisions were made.
In the following months, Daniel proved true to that promise in ways that surprised even Olivia. He not only met his contractual obligations, but went beyond them, implementing radical policies for the tech industry, such as complete salary transparency to combat pay disparities, generous parental leave for all employees regardless of gender or status in the company, and a profit-sharing program that distributed 20% of the company's annual profits directly to non-executive employees based on tenure. These policies were initially resisted by other executives and board members who argued they were financially irresponsible and would create unsustainable expectations. But Daniel presented data showing that companies with employee-centric cultures consistently outperformed competitors in the long term because they had lower turnover, higher productivity, better innovation, and stronger reputations that facilitated recruiting top talent. He argued passionately that treating people well was not charity, but smart business strategy, and that Whitmore Industries had an opportunity to model a different path for corporate capitalism, one that proved you didn't have to choose between profits and principles. And gradually, he gained allies. Other executives started seeing tangible results from the people-centric policies. Employee satisfaction increased dramatically in internal surveys. Productivity went up. The company began consistently appearing on lists of best places to work, which attracted exceptional candidates who previously would have chosen Google or Apple. And more surprisingly, profits didn't suffer. In fact, they grew because engaged, loyal employees worked harder, innovated more effectively, and stayed with the company longer, reducing massive turnover and recruitment costs. Daniel's transformation also did not go unnoticed by the business media. An investigative reporter from Forbes heard rumors about the unusual one-month test Olivia had administered, and eventually Daniel agreed to speak publicly about the experience. The resulting article, titled "From CEO to Janitor: How 1 Month of Humble Work Transformed a Wall Street Executive's Vision," went viral, was shared millions of times, started national conversations about corporate culture and inequality, and inspired other business leaders to consider similar experiments in their own organizations. Daniel was invited to speak at business conferences, he appeared on podcasts and interview shows, and he always used those platforms to advocate not for his own story, but for the people like Marcus, Rosa, and Pierre who did essential work but were systematically undervalued by society. He spoke about how the current minimum wage was a moral injustice, how immigration policies punished people like Rosa who contributed enormously to the American economy, how the educational system failed to value vocational expertise as much as academic education, leaving people like Marcus without the recognition they deserved. And he always ended his speeches with the same challenge to other executives, asking how many of them knew the names of the people who clean their offices, who serve their meals, who maintain their gardens. And if they didn't know those names, then how could they claim to understand their own companies or the societies they operated in? Because companies weren't abstractions, they were collectives of real people, and leadership meant serving all those people, not just extracting value from them.
Approximately 8 months after Daniel started as chief financial officer of Whitmore Industries, something happened that would test whether his transformation was genuine or merely performative. The company was negotiating a potential acquisition of an Austin-based artificial intelligence startup called Neural Path Technologies, which had promising technology but was struggling financially. The startup was founded by 3 young entrepreneurs, including someone from Daniel's past. His name was Brandon Mitchell, and he had been a junior assistant at McKinsey 5 years ago when Daniel was a senior consultant there. At the time, Daniel had treated Brandon terribly, using him as a scapegoat for project errors, stealing credit for Brandon's ideas, and consistently humiliating him in meetings in front of clients and colleagues. Brandon eventually left McKinsey completely burned out and disillusioned with corporate culture, and spent the following years building his startup with fierce determination to prove his worth. Now here was Daniel, in a position of immense power over the future of Brandon's company. The irony was palpable. The first meeting between the teams from Whitmore Industries and Neural Path Technologies was scheduled for a Tuesday at the corporate office in San Francisco. Daniel arrived early to review due diligence documents, preparing for technical discussions about valuation and terms. When Brandon walked into the conference room with his co-founders, the 2 men made eye contact and time seemed to stop. Brandon's face showed immediate recognition, followed by a series of emotions: surprise, apprehension, and something that looked like residual anger from years of abusive treatment. Daniel felt his stomach tighten because he knew exactly what Brandon was thinking, that the universe had conspired to place Brandon at the mercy of the man who had tormented him years ago, and that everything Brandon had built now depended on Daniel's approval. The meeting started tensely, with Brandon's co-founders presenting their technology and growth projections, but it was obvious that Brandon was distracted. His answers were short, he avoided looking directly at Daniel, and there was a rigidity in his shoulders that suggested he was ready for confrontation. After 2 hours of technical presentations, Olivia, who was leading the negotiations for the Whitmore side, called for a lunch break. During the break, Daniel asked to speak with Brandon privately. They went to an empty office and closed the door. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Daniel could see decades of pain and anger in Brandon's eyes and knew he deserved every bit of it. Finally, Daniel spoke. He said directly and honestly that he needed to apologize for how he had treated Brandon years ago at McKinsey, said that that behavior was completely unacceptable, that he had been a terrible boss and a worse person, that he used his power to make Brandon's life miserable, not for any legitimate reason, but because the toxic corporate culture rewarded that kind of abusive behavior, and Daniel had never had the moral courage to resist it. Brandon listened with a skeptical expression, clearly not expecting this opening, and then responded with barely contained anger. He said that those years at McKinsey had nearly destroyed him, that he developed severe anxiety and depression, that his marriage almost ended because of the stress, and that he had spent years in therapy working through the trauma of having been systematically dehumanized in his workplace.
Brandon said the worst part wasn't even the abuse itself, but the way everyone else simply watched and allowed it to happen. Colleagues who knew it was wrong but never intervened because they were afraid of becoming targets too. And now Daniel showed up years later with pretty apologies, expecting what exactly? Instant forgiveness? An undeserved second chance? Daniel let Brandon fully vent without interrupting or defending himself. And when Brandon finally fell silent, exhausted from expressing years of pent-up anger, Daniel said something Brandon clearly wasn't expecting. He said that he neither expected nor deserved forgiveness, that apologies didn't undo harm, and that he completely understood if Brandon wanted to abandon the acquisition negotiations immediately. Because the idea of working with Daniel or having Daniel in a position of power over his company was intolerable. Daniel said that he would personally talk to Olivia and explain that he needed to recuse himself from the negotiation because of a personal conflict, and that he would ensure Brandon and his co-founders received fair consideration from other executives at Whitmore Industries who didn't carry that problematic history. Furthermore, Daniel offered to connect Brandon with contacts at other tech companies who might be interested in acquiring or investing in NeuralPath, even if it meant losing the deal to competitors, because doing the right thing for Brandon was more important than any business transaction. Brandon was visibly surprised by this offer. He had walked into that conversation expecting Daniel to deny or minimize the past, or maybe offer empty apologies while expecting them to simply move forward professionally. But instead, Daniel was voluntarily giving up power and putting Brandon's needs above corporate interests. It was so unexpected that Brandon didn't know how to respond initially. They sat in silence for several minutes while Brandon processed, and then he asked Daniel a direct question. He asked what had changed, why the man who was so cruel years ago was now acting with what seemed genuine humility and concern. And Daniel told the whole story. He talked about his first day at Whitmore Mansion and the humiliating mistake he made, about the 1-month test working in various service positions, about Marcus and Rosa and Pierre and all the lessons they taught through their examples of dignity and hard work, about how that month forced him to confront how much of a terrible person he had been for essentially his entire adult life, and about his continued daily attempt to be better, to use power differently, to create work cultures where people like Brandon would be protected, not victimized. Brandon listened to the whole story, and Daniel could see he was genuinely considering it, weighing the man in front of him against his memories of the monster from years ago. Finally, Brandon said that he would need to think about all this, talk to his co-founders, maybe even consult his therapist, but he was willing to consider continuing the acquisition negotiations if Daniel genuinely recused himself and allowed other Whitmore executives to take over the Whitmore negotiations. Because despite everything, NeuralPath's technology would be a perfect integration with Whitmore's products, and the acquisition could be genuinely beneficial for everyone involved. They returned to the conference room where Olivia and the others waited. Daniel immediately explained that he needed to recuse himself from the negotiation due to a personal conflict from a shared history with Brandon, and that he had recommended that Sarah Chen, the VP of Corporate Development, take over the Whitmore negotiations. Olivia looked between Daniel and Brandon, clearly understanding that something significant had happened, but she simply nodded and agreed to the arrangement. After the meeting ended and the NeuralPath teams left, Olivia asked Daniel to stay behind. She closed the conference room door and asked directly what had happened, and Daniel told her everything. He didn't try to minimize or embellish his past behavior. He explained exactly how awful he had been to Brandon and why recusing himself was the only ethical thing to do. Olivia listened and then made an observation that stuck with Daniel. She said that true growth wasn't about never making mistakes, but about taking responsibility for those mistakes and doing whatever was possible to repair harm. That Daniel had demonstrated more character in that single decision to recuse himself than many executives showed in entire careers, because recusing himself meant publicly admitting past failures and voluntarily giving up power. And there was very little that the corporate system valued less than that kind of humility. But that was precisely the mentality Olivia was trying to cultivate at Whitmore Industries, so she was proud of him. In the following weeks, negotiations continued under Sarah Chen's leadership, and eventually terms were agreed to for the acquisition of NeuralPath Technologies. Brandon and his co-founders joined Whitmore Industries, bringing their innovative technology and receiving compensation that made them financially secure for years in the first time. And although Daniel and Brandon did not instantly become friends, there was a gradual thaw. They collaborated on some projects, maintaining a respectful professional relationship, and over time, Brandon commented to colleagues that seeing Daniel's transformation truly happen over months and years, not just words, but consistent actions that demonstrated change values, had been part of his own healing process, because it proved that people really could change, that toxic systems could be reformed, and that there was hope for better corporate culture if enough leaders were willing to do the hard work.
The success of Daniel's transformation and the progressive policies he helped implement at Whitmore Industries began to attract attention from other companies and business leaders. Some were genuinely interested in replicating that model. Others were skeptical, thinking it was just elaborate public relations, and some were openly hostile, seeing it as a betrayal of the profit maximization ideology that dominated Wall Street. Approximately 8 months after Daniel started at Whitmore Industries, he was invited to be a keynote speaker at an executive leadership conference in Chicago. The topic was innovation in corporate culture, and there would be hundreds of CEOs and CFOs from Fortune 500 companies present. Daniel was nervous because he knew many people in that audience would see his story as an implicit criticism of how they ran their own businesses, and he was not wrong in that assumption. His talk, titled From Arrogance to Humility, The Month That Changed My View of Leadership, honestly detailed his journey from that first humiliating day at Whitmore Mansion to the present. He did not spare himself. He described in specific detail how arrogant and disrespectful he had been, how he had treated people as disposable objects based purely on their perceived status, and how 1 month of working in service positions had forced him to confront his own moral failings. He then discussed the specific policies Whitmore Industries had implemented: salary transparency, profit sharing, generous parental leave, subsidized childcare programs, investment in continuing education for employees, and presented data showing that these policies had not harmed profitability, but actually increased it through higher employee retention, higher productivity, and stronger brand reputation. The reaction was mixed. About half the audience applauded enthusiastically, clearly resonating with the message and interested in exploring similar approaches in their own organizations, but the other half was visibly uncomfortable or even hostile. During the question and answer period, a particularly aggressive CEO from a private equity firm stood up and challenged Daniel directly. He said that this all sounded nice but was fundamentally unrealistic, that public companies had a fiduciary duty to shareholders to maximize returns, and that spending resources on elaborate social programs for employees was essentially stealing value from shareholders. He argued that if workers wanted better wages and benefits, they should develop more valuable skills and get better jobs, that the market should determine compensation, not some misguided sense of corporate charity, and that Daniel's job was to manage finances, not do social activism. Daniel took a deep breath before responding. He said he understood that perspective because he himself had held it for years. But there was a fundamental flaw in the logic. The idea that maximizing shareholder value required minimizing investment in employees was not only morally problematic, but also economically short-sighted. He cited extensive studies showing that companies that invested in their people consistently outperformed those that did not in long-term metrics, including stock valuation, because engaged and loyal employees were more productive, innovative, and created better customer relationships. Furthermore, the idea that workers should simply develop better skills ignored the structural realities of the modern economy. Someone had to do those essential lower-wage jobs. Someone had to clean buildings, grow food, drive delivery trucks, care for children and the elderly, and those people deserved to be able to live dignified lives, not just survive paycheck to paycheck. Suggesting otherwise was essentially arguing that some human beings had less intrinsic worth than others based purely on economic function. And that was both morally repugnant and socially destructive.
As for the fiduciary duty to shareholders, Daniel argued that it was interpreted too narrowly. Long-term shareholders benefited when companies built sustainable cultures, strong reputations, and positive relationships with all stakeholders, including employees, customers, and communities. Focusing exclusively on short-term quarterly profits often destroyed long-term value through scandals, massive turnover, crushed morale, and reputational damage that took years to repair. Daniel's answer was met with applause from part of the audience, but the private equity CEO merely shook his head disdainfully and sat down, clearly unconvinced. After the speech, several people approached Daniel, some offering congratulations and asking for advice on implementing similar policies, others wanting to debate business philosophy further, and some admitting privately that they had treated their own employees poorly and were struggling with guilt about it. One particularly memorable conversation was with the CEO of a mid-sized retail company based in Atlanta, Georgia. Her name was Jennifer Patterson, and she had built her business from the ground up over 15 years. She told Daniel that his speech had triggered something deep in her because she recognized her own journey in his story. She also started out with idealism about how she would treat employees differently, but over the years, the pressures of growth, competition, and investors demanding ever-increasing returns had pushed her to make decisions she wasn't proud of, cutting benefits to save costs, resisting salary increases even when she knew people were struggling financially, creating increasingly stressful work environments where employees were treated as resources to be maximized, not people to be valued. And now, years later, she had a profitable business but terrible employee turnover, low morale, and chronic difficulty hiring quality people because her reputation as an employer was poor. Jennifer asked if it was too late to change, if a company could truly transform its culture after years of operating differently, or if toxic patterns became so entrenched that they were irreversible. Daniel said honestly that he didn't know for sure because every company was different, but he believed that change was always possible if leadership was genuinely committed and willing to do the hard work for years, not just months. He suggested that Jennifer consider doing something similar to what Olivia had done with him, not necessarily as extreme as a full month working in service positions, but finding ways to genuinely connect with employees at all levels, to listen to their experiences and challenges without defensiveness, to demonstrate through actions, not just words, that he valued them. And he also cautioned her that real cultural transformation took time and required perseverance because there would be resistance from middle managers who were invested in the status quo, from investors who would question the ROI of people-centric programs, and even from some employees who had become so cynical that they wouldn't believe change was possible. But if she remained committed to the principles and consistently modeled the behavior she wanted to see, gradually the culture would shift. Jennifer thanked Daniel and they exchanged contact information, promising to stay connected as she tried to implement changes in her company. And that conversation was one of many Daniel had over the following months as his story continued to spread and resonate with leaders who were secretly dissatisfied with the cultures they had created, but didn't know how to change.
Approximately 18 months after Daniel started at Whitmore Industries, something remarkable began to happen. Other technology companies in Silicon Valley and beyond began to adopt policies similar to those Whitmore had implemented. Initially, it was just a handful of smaller startups whose founders had read about the Whitmore approach and wanted to try something different, but gradually, larger, more established companies began to pay attention. Part of this was because data began to emerge showing measurable results from the people-centric policies. Researchers at Stanford Business School published a detailed case study on Whitmore Industries, documenting how the company had improved employee retention by 40%, increased employee satisfaction scores by 55%, and simultaneously improved profits by 23% compared to the previous year. The study persuasively argued that those results were not a coincidence, but causally connected. Employees who felt valued and fairly compensated worked harder, stayed longer, and contributed more creatively to solving business problems. Furthermore, the studies showed that Whitmore's improved reputation as an employer had allowed the company to recruit exceptional talent who previously would have chosen Google, Facebook, or Apple because Millennial and Gen Z workers increasingly prioritize corporate culture and values over maximum salary when choosing employers.
That Stanford study was widely circulated and cited, appearing in the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, The Economist, and dozens of other business publications, and it began to shift conversations in boardrooms around the world about what constituted optimal business practices. Of course, there were also vocal counter-arguments. Several conservative economists and business commentators argued that Whitmore was a special case because it was a private company not subject to the pressures of public shareholders, and that the model could never work at scale for Fortune 500 companies. They said that Olivia Whitmore had the luxury of prioritizing principles over profits because she was a billionaire heiress who didn't need to worry about demanding investors or activist hedge funds threatening hostile takeovers. And there was some truth to that. Being a private company definitely gave Whitmore more flexibility. But Daniel argued that this missed the point. Yes, the ownership structure mattered, but the fundamental principles were applicable regardless. Any company could choose to treat employees with respect, could implement salary transparency, could invest in employee development, could create decision-making processes that valued input from people at all levels, not just top executives. These were not issues of financial resources, but of values and priorities. Many public companies spent billions on stock buybacks and dividends to enrich shareholders while simultaneously paying entry-level employees so little that they qualified for government public assistance. That was a choice, not an economic necessity, and it was a choice that subsidized corporate profits through taxpayers while creating massive inequality. To prove his point, Daniel began advising CEOs of public companies who were genuinely interested in transforming their cultures. He worked with a manufacturing company based in Michigan that was struggling with terrible turnover and low morale, helped them redesign compensation structures to include profit sharing, implement training programs that allowed production line employees to move into higher technical positions, and create real communication channels where workers could express concerns without fear of retaliation. Within a year, that company saw turnover drop by 60% and productivity increase by 35%. He worked with a hospital network in Florida to improve conditions for nursing staff who were overworked and underpaid, helped them secure funding to hire additional nurses, reducing workload to manageable levels, raise salaries to remain competitive with neighboring hospitals, and create wellness programs that addressed burnout and mental health. The result was drastically improved retention of experienced nurses who were critical to patient care quality. And he worked with a call center company in Texas that had a terrible reputation as an employer, helped them eliminate draconian metrics that measured employees by seconds and treated them like robots, implement more flexible scheduling that accommodated family needs, and create career progression paths so that call center work wasn't a dead end, but an entry point to better positions within the company. These interventions were not easy or quick. Each required months of careful work to understand the existing culture, identify core problems, design appropriate solutions, and then implement changes in a way that stuck. But in every case, Daniel saw that when companies genuinely prioritized employee well-being, the results were consistent. People worked better, stayed longer, and contributed more creatively, and those benefits more than offset the increased costs of better wages and benefits. Of course, not every company that attempted changes succeeded. Some efforts failed because leadership was not truly committed, but merely making performative gestures for public relations. Some failed because middle managers sabotaged changes, protecting their own power domains. And some failed simply because external pressures from investors or market conditions made it impossible to maintain commitment to long-term policies. But even those failures taught valuable lessons about what was necessary for real cultural transformation. Not just pretty words and mission statements, but fundamental structural changes in how power and resources were distributed, how decisions were made, and how success was defined and measured.
Despite all the successes and positive attention that Whitmore Industries and Daniel personally were receiving, not everything was perfect. 2 years after his hiring, Daniel faced one of the most difficult challenges of his tenure at the company. Whitmore Industries was considering opening a new manufacturing facility, and there were two main options. One was to build in the San Jose area, which had high labor costs but access to a highly qualified workforce. The other was to build in rural North Carolina, where labor costs were significantly lower, but the region had a history of weak environmental regulations and labor laws that strongly favored employers over workers. From a purely financial perspective, North Carolina made much more sense. Projections showed the company would save approximately $40 million in the first 5 years operating there versus California, and several board members strongly pushed for that option. They argued that the company had an obligation to maximize efficiency, and that building in California when a much cheaper alternative was available was irresponsible. But Daniel and Olivia had serious concerns about the North Carolina option. Research revealed that similar companies operating in that specific region had problematic histories of workplace safety violations, paid wages that were technically legal but insufficient for a decent standard of living, and had resisted worker organizing attempts using aggressive tactics that were legal under weak state laws but ethically questionable. Building there would essentially mean taking advantage of a regulatory structure that allowed for worker exploitation. And that was fundamentally contrary to the values Whitmore supposedly championed. But the numbers were undeniable. $40 million was a substantial amount, even for a company the size of Whitmore. And choosing the more expensive option purely for ethical reasons meant leaving significant money on the table. The debate within executive leadership was intense and at times heated. Sarah Chen, who had replaced Daniel in the neural path negotiations and had since become a strong ally, argued passionately that building in North Carolina would send a terrible message both internally and externally, that the company could not credibly claim to value workers while deliberately choosing a location that facilitated exploitative labor practices, that the short-term financial savings would be destroyed by long-term reputational damage. But the previous CFO, who was still on the board, countered that this was naivety, that the company was not a charity organization and had responsibilities to financial stakeholders, that other companies operated perfectly well in that region and no one crucified them for it, that building in California based on noble feelings was a luxury few businesses could afford, especially in the competitive technology industry. Daniel listened to both sides carefully during several tense meetings and then asked for something unusual. He requested permission to personally visit both potential locations, not just to see the proposed facilities, but to talk to workers at similar companies already operating in those areas, to understand their lived experiences, their concerns, their hopes, because decisions could not be made just by looking at spreadsheets and financial projections. They needed to be informed by the human reality of what each choice would mean for real people. Olivia agreed immediately, and Daniel spent the next 2 weeks traveling. In California, he visited various tech manufacturing companies in San Jose and the surrounding area, speaking with production engineers, technicians, maintenance staff, and managers. What he found was a well-paid and highly skilled workforce, people who could afford to buy homes even in the expensive Bay Area real estate market, send children to good schools, save for retirement, and generally live comfortable middle-class lives. There were challenges, certainly. Cost of living was high, traffic was terrible, and competition for talent meant companies had to work hard to retain good employees. But generally, the ecosystem supported workers living with dignity. In North Carolina, the story was dramatically different. Daniel visited 3 manufacturing facilities in the proposed rural area, and what he saw deeply disturbed him. Workers earned between $12 and $15 an hour for work that was physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. Very few received adequate health benefits. Many worked second jobs just to pay basic bills. He spoke with a woman named Patricia, who had worked on a production line for 8 years and still couldn't afford to go to the dentist to take care of a painful problem because her insurance covered almost nothing. He met James, who had lost 2 fingers in a workplace accident and received minimal compensation because the company argued it was his negligence, not the company's. And he talked to Maria, who was trying to organize a union to negotiate better conditions, but faced systematic intimidation from management, including veiled threats about losing her job. These were not abstract statistics or theoretical projections, but real people suffering real consequences from economic structures that prioritized value extraction over human well-being.
And Daniel knew that if Whitmore built there, even with the best intentions, they would be part of that system. When he returned to San Francisco, Daniel prepared a detailed presentation for the board. He included the normal financial analysis showing cost differences, but he also included something that had never appeared in board presentations before: detailed profiles of workers he had met in both locations, their stories, their struggles, their dreams. He showed photographs with faces and names, shared quotes from conversations, and forced every board member to see beyond the numbers to the real humanity impacted by their decisions. Then he made his recommendation. He said that Whitmore should build in San Jose despite the higher costs because that was the only choice consistent with the values the company claimed to represent. But he went beyond that. He proposed that Whitmore not only build in California, but use the project as an opportunity to demonstrate a new model for tech manufacturing. They would pay above-market wages even for entry-level positions, implement safety standards that exceeded regulatory requirements, create extensive training programs that allowed workers to progress, and work with the local community to ensure that housing and infrastructure were adequate to sustain a growing workforce. Yes, it would cost more, but it would send a powerful message about what kind of company Whitmore was, and it would create a competitive advantage in attracting top talent, who increasingly chose employers based on values, not just salary. Daniel's presentation was followed by hours of debate. Some board members were convinced, others remained skeptical. But finally, Olivia, who as the majority owner had final decision power, agreed with Daniel's recommendation. Whitmore would build in San Jose and make the project a model for responsible manufacturing. The decision generated headlines because it was so unusual. Companies normally moved operations to cheaper locations, not deliberately chose the more expensive ones. And critics predicted it would be a financial disaster that would prove Whitmore's model was unsustainable. But when the facility finally opened 2 years later, those predictions proved wrong. Yes, operating costs were higher than they would have been in North Carolina, but the facility exceeded all performance metrics. Productivity was extraordinary because well-treated and fairly compensated workers worked harder. Quality was exceptional because people took pride in their work. Turnover was almost zero, saving massive recruitment and training costs. And the facility became a case study visited by executives from companies around the world, wanting to see how the worker-centric model worked in practice. For Daniel, that victory was a validation not just of the specific decision, but of the entire philosophy he had embraced since that transformative month working in service positions at the mansion, proving that treating people well was not only morally correct, but also economically smart, and that companies that rejected that false choice between profits and principles could succeed in ways that benefited all stakeholders, not just shareholders.
Approximately 3 years after Daniel started at Whitmore Industries, something notable began to happen. He received an unexpected phone call that brought his journey full circle in a surprising way. It was from a television producer who wanted to make a documentary about his transformation and the broader impact the story was having on corporate culture. Initially, Daniel refused because the idea of cameras documenting his life made him deeply uncomfortable. He didn't want it to be about him personally, but about the larger principles and the people like Marcus and Rosa who truly deserved recognition. But Olivia encouraged him to reconsider, arguing that visual media reached audiences who would never read academic articles or attend business conferences, that a well-made documentary could spread those ideas to millions of people and potentially inspire change on a much larger scale. So Daniel reluctantly agreed with specific conditions. The documentary would have to equally feature Marcus, Rosa, Pierre, and other workers whose stories were as important as his own. It could not overly glamorize or dramatize the events, but had to be an honest representation, including his failures and ongoing struggles. And any profits from the documentary would be donated to nonprofits focused on workers' rights and reducing inequality. The producer agreed to all those terms, and over the next 6 months, a small team of documentarians followed Daniel and other main characters of the story. They interviewed Marcus in his gardens, talking about his decades of work and philosophy on dignity and manual labor. They filmed Rosa with her family, including her daughter, who was now in her final year at UCLA with a clear path to a career in engineering that would have been impossible without the sacrifices Rosa made. They captured Pierre in the kitchen, teaching young chefs not just culinary techniques, but life lessons about respect and excellence. And they documented Daniel's daily work, including moments of triumph, but also frustrations when change came slower than he hoped. A particularly powerful part of the documentary was when they filmed Daniel returning to the sites of his past. They went to the McKinsey offices in New York, where Daniel had worked and treated Brandon so terribly, and managed to interview several former colleagues who spoke honestly about the toxic culture that existed there. The constant pressure to work 80 or 90 hours a week, the brutal competition among colleagues, the dehumanizing treatment of junior staff who were seen as disposable, and how that had harmed the mental health and relationships of many people. Some of those former colleagues admitted that they too had treated others poorly during their time there, that the environment practically forced you to become a worse version of yourself to survive. And several said that Daniel's story had inspired them to rethink their own career trajectories and priorities. The documentary also included a segment about Brandon Mitchell and how the experience of being treated abusively and then seeing his abuser transform had impacted him. Brandon spoke with remarkable vulnerability about his years of therapy, about how he almost left the business world completely because his trust was so destroyed, and about how seeing genuine change in Daniel, over years, not months, had helped him believe that people could grow and that forgiveness was possible. That segment was extraordinarily powerful because it didn't offer a simplistic resolution or easy redemption. Brandon was clear that he still carried scars from that experience and probably always would. But he also recognized that Daniel had done real work to change and deserved recognition for that. When the documentary, titled The CEO Janitor, A Story of Transformation, was released on a major streaming platform, it became an unexpected cultural sensation. It was watched by millions of people in the first few weeks, generated endless conversations on social media, inspired opinion pieces in every major publication, and most importantly, started conversations in offices and dining rooms across the country about how we treat workers, what we value as a society, and what kind of capitalism we want. Business schools started using the documentary in classes on ethics and leadership, labor activist groups showed it at organizing events, and even politicians began referencing it in debates about minimum wage and workers' rights. Of course, there was also an inevitable backlash. Some critics argued that it was anti-capitalist propaganda in disguise. Others said it glamorized an isolated case that wasn't replicable at scale. And there were even ridiculous conspiracy theories suggesting the whole story was fabricated for public relations. But those critics were a minority. Most people who watched the documentary responded with something rare in contemporary public discourse: genuine empathy and a willingness to consider different perspectives. Months after the documentary's release, Daniel started receiving letters, hundreds of them, then thousands from people across the country and eventually around the world. Service workers wrote thanking him for telling their stories and recognizing their humanity. Executives wrote confessing their own problematic behaviors and asking for advice on how to change. Young people wrote saying the documentary had inspired them to choose careers in business, but with a commitment to do differently than previous generations. A particularly touching letter came from a young woman named Sophia, who worked as a cleaner in a corporate office building in Dallas. She wrote about how invisible she was to most of the people who worked there, how they walked past her without acknowledgement, even when she was cleaning literally around them, and how seeing her humanity recognized in the documentary had made her cry because someone finally understood. She said she kept a photo of Rosa from the documentary at her workstation as a reminder that her work had dignity even if others didn't see it. Danielle personally responded to as many of those letters as possible and kept each one in a special file because they reminded him of why that work mattered. It wasn't about him or his personal redemption, it was about millions of people like Sophia, whose essential contributions were systematically undervalued and whose humanity was routinely ignored. In the 4th year of Daniel's tenure at Whitmore Industries, he and Olivia faced an uncomfortable realization. Despite all the successes in transforming the company's culture, creating worker-centric policies, and inspiring some other organizations to do similarly, they were running up against the limits of what individual corporate change could achieve. The fundamental problem was that even well-intentioned companies operated within larger economic and political systems that created structural pressures for exploitation. Consider the issue of supply chains. Whitmore Industries manufactured electronic products that required components from suppliers worldwide. Many of those suppliers were in countries with weak or non-existent labor protections, where people worked in conditions that would be illegal in the United States for wages that barely covered subsistence. Whitmore tried to implement strict standards for suppliers, requiring regular audits and certifications that workers were treated fairly, but the reality was that those audit systems were easy to fool. Suppliers would learn what auditors wanted to see and temporarily improve conditions during inspections, only to revert afterward. Or they would subcontract to smaller, unaudited facilities where real abuses happened out of sight. And when Whitmore tried to cut ties with problematic suppliers, they discovered that alternatives were limited. Only a few producers in the world could manufacture certain specialized components in the necessary quantities, so the choice was often between working with imperfect suppliers or not being able to manufacture products at all. Similarly, the issue of executive compensation presented difficult dilemmas. Daniel had voluntarily reduced his own salary by 20% and refused stock bonuses that would have been worth millions, using that money to increase salaries for entry-level workers. But he still earned multiple millions per year, while some Whitmore employees struggled to pay rent in expensive markets. The disparity was smaller than at most companies, but still ethically problematic. When he proposed more dramatic reductions in executive compensation, including Olivia's own, they faced resistance not just from other executives, but also from recruiters, who warned that they wouldn't be able to attract top talent if compensation was significantly below market. And although Daniel believed that the right people would join the company for the mission, not just money, he had to admit there was some truth to that. The corporate talent recruitment system was structured around compensation as the primary indicator of value, and operating completely outside that system created real practical challenges. So here was the central dilemma. The changes Whitmore Industries made were significant and improved the lives of thousands of workers, but they were fundamentally limited because they happened within broader capitalist structures that systematically prioritize capital accumulation over human well-being. True transformative change required not just better companies, but different economic systems, different government policies, different cultural structures about how we value work and people. That realization forced Daniel and Olivia to start thinking beyond corporate reform to broader political advocacy. They began using their platforms and resources to support policies that would systematically benefit workers. Minimum wage increases, universal health care, mandatory paid family leave, stronger labor organization rights, stricter environmental regulations, tax reform that would require corporations and wealthy individuals to pay their fair share. These were not popular positions in business circles. Supporting stronger regulations and higher taxes was essentially arguing against their own short-term financial interests, and they faced heavy criticism from other CEOs and business groups who accused them of betraying the business class. A particularly tense confrontation happened at a business leadership conference in Washington, D.C., where Daniel was invited to participate in a panel on the future of work. Another panelist was the CEO of a large retail company known for low wages and aggressive opposition to unions. During the discussion, that CEO argued that raising the minimum wage would destroy jobs by forcing companies to automate faster, and that workers should be grateful for the jobs they had, even if the pay was low, because the alternative was unemployment. Daniel couldn't let that argument pass unchallenged. He responded by pointing out that that CEO personally earned $150 million the previous year, while the average employee at his company earned less than $25,000 annually. That his company profited billions while thousands of employees qualified for food stamps and other public assistance programs. That this was essentially a transfer of wealth from taxpayers to wealthy shareholders. And arguing that raising wages would destroy jobs ignored the reality that consumption drives the economy and poorly paid workers couldn't buy products that kept companies thriving.
The interchange became heated and uncomfortable, and Daniel learned afterward that some conference organizers were annoyed that he had created conflict. But he also received private messages from dozens of people in the audience saying that someone had finally said what needed to be said, that they were tired of pretending that extreme inequality was normal or acceptable, and that they wanted to help create a movement for real change. 5 years after that first humiliating day at Whitmore Mansion, Daniel stood on the same terrace where Olivia had offered him the chief financial officer position with conditions, but this time the occasion was different. Whitmore Industries was hosting a special event to announce a new initiative. The Whitmore Foundation for Worker Dignity would be a nonprofit organization endowed with $500 million, focused on advocacy for workers' rights, education, and direct support for labor organizations across the country. Furthermore, Olivia announced that she was restructuring the ownership of Whitmore Industries. She would maintain majority control, but 20% of the company would be transferred to an employee-owned trust, meaning everyone who worked for the company now literally owned a part of it and would share in its success. Those announcements received massive media coverage. Some commentators praised it as a radical and necessary vision for a fairer capitalism. Others criticized it as dangerously idealistic. But regardless of political opinion, no one could deny that it represented an extraordinary commitment to principles over profits. During the event, Daniel had the opportunity to speak, and he used that moment not to congratulate himself, but to tell the story of where everything began. He spoke honestly about the arrogant and terrible man he was when he first arrived at that mansion, about how he treated Olivia when he thought she was just an employee, about the deep humiliation of that mistake and the subsequent tests she administered. He spoke about Marcus, Rosa, and Pierre, and all the other extraordinary people who taught him what truly mattered through examples of dignity and hard work. Told about working until his hands developed blisters, about learning to value types of expertise he had never considered before, about realizing he had wasted decades pursuing the wrong things and treating people the wrong way. And he spoke about Brandon and others he had harmed over the years through his arrogance and casual cruelty, acknowledging that apologies never undid harm, but that genuine change was possible if you were willing to do the hard work of confronting your own flaws and growing beyond them. But the most important part of Daniel's speech was when he shifted focus from his personal journey to the larger systematic issue. He said that while the individual story of transformation was interesting, the real point wasn't about him. It was about millions of people like Marcus, Rosa, and Pierre, whose essential contributions were systematically undervalued, who did work that allowed society to function but were treated as invisible or disposable, who deserved not charity or paternalism but fundamental recognition of their equal dignity and worth as human beings. Daniel argued passionately that the way we treat service workers, retail workers, care workers, manual laborers, and all those in positions society labels as low skill reveals our true collective character as a civilization. He said we claim to value equality and opportunity, but create economic systems where people can work full-time and still live in poverty, where a CEO can earn in 1 hour what an average employee earns in a year, where billionaires exploit tax loopholes to pay effective rates lower than teachers or nurses, where corporations profit billions while taxpayers subsidize poorly paid employees through assistance programs. That wasn't an accident or an inevitable result of market forces. It was the result of specific political and corporate choices made by people with power. And it meant it could be changed through different choices. He acknowledged that Whitmore Industries was just one company and that even with the best intentions, it operated within larger systems that created pressures for exploitation, that real change required not just better companies, but better policies, a living minimum wage, universal health care, mandatory paid family leave, stronger labor rights, progressive taxation that would reduce extreme inequality, regulations that would prevent a race to the bottom where companies competed by suppressing wages and conditions. But he also argued that companies didn't need to wait for government mandates to do the right thing. Whitmore had proven that treating people well was not only morally correct, but economically viable. That worker-centric cultures produced better results, not despite costing more, but because investing in people created genuine value. So the challenge to other business leaders was simple. Stop hiding behind excuses about competitive pressures or fiduciary obligations and admit that choosing exploitation over dignity is exactly that, a choice, and one that reveals character.
But that was the point, wasn't it? Real transformation meant becoming fundamentally different, shedding old identities and embracing new ones. And although the process was often painful and humiliating, it was also liberating in ways he never could have anticipated. Looking around at that group gathered on the terrace, seeing the faces of people who had become not just colleagues, but genuine friends and teachers, Daniel finally understood what truly mattered. It wasn't wealth or status or power over others. It was connection. It was community. It was contributing to something bigger than oneself. It was treating all people, regardless of position or function, with the basic respect and dignity that every human being deserved. And it was using whatever privilege or platform you had not to elevate yourself above others, but to elevate others along with you. The sun was setting over the Beverly Hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and in that golden light, Daniel made a renewed promise to himself and to those extraordinary people around him. He promised that he would never forget where he had come from, never forget how lost he had been, never forget the lessons that had saved him from a life of empty arrogance and casual cruelty. And he would use every remaining day of his career and life to honor those lessons, to fight for systems that valued people over profits, to advocate for those whose voices were rarely heard in rooms of power, and to always remember that being mistaken for an employee when you are actually the boss was not an insult, but an opportunity to see how you truly treated people when you thought no one important was watching. And in that most fundamental test of character, Daniel had failed spectacularly. But through the extraordinary grace of people like Olivia and Marcus and Rosa, he had received an undeserved second chance. And he would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of that second chance, not through words, but through actions. Not through grandiose gestures, but through daily, consistent choices to value human dignity above all else. As the groups finally began to disperse and people headed toward their homes and families, Daniel remained for a few more moments, looking at those beautiful gardens that Marcus and the team maintained so meticulously, thinking about that lavender path that would continue blooming long after he was gone, and smiling with genuine gratitude for the improbable journey that had brought him from that humiliating first day to this moment of genuine purpose and connection. He didn't know what the future would bring, what challenges would emerge, what new lessons would need to be learned, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never again be that person who judged others based on appearances or positions, who treated service workers as invisible, who valued status over substance and profits over people. That man was dead, and in his place was someone still imperfect, still learning, still making mistakes occasionally, but fundamentally committed to different values and a different vision of how business and society could operate. And it was all because he had confused a CEO with a maid, and she had seen in that mistake not just a character flaw, but an opportunity for transformation, an opportunity that changed not just one life, but potentially helped start a bigger movement toward a more humane and compassionate capitalism. And with that final thought, Daniel descended from the terrace and walked through the gardens toward his car. No longer the Mercedes he drove years ago, but a modest hybrid, because he had learned, finally, that true value didn't come from external symbols of success, but from knowing that you were living aligned with your deepest values and contributing positively to the world. And as he drove out through the gates of Whitmore Mansion for the last time that night, he looked in the rearview mirror and whispered, "Thank you," to the property that had been his greatest teacher. Then turned and looked ahead, toward the uncertain but hopeful future, where the work of building a fairer world would continue, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one person at a time. And so, what did you think of this incredible story of transformation, humility, and redemption?
Rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us what part touched you the most. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next exciting stories.